Section 4.3 discusses art and the cycle of life. This refers to sort of universal experiences that humanity has around the world. It addresses fundamental questions of existence, like where do we come from or where do we go once we die, as well as things like what is our purpose during life. So as a theme, the cycle of life within the visual arts refers to um, how artists explore birth, death, and sort of what happens in between. The passage of time, aging, as well as sort of natural forces and cycles that occur around us within nature. Um, Artists typically tend to explore ideas of the finality of death and examine life's mysteries in the form of mystical visions, narrative accounts, and other visual portrayals. Stories about the beginnings of civilization and the creation of humankind have been found throughout history in cultures across the globe. And oftentimes, these creation myths, whether they incorporate nature or natural occurrences or the actions of deities and other spirits, these have inspired artists of all kinds. So here we have a relief panel from the Temple of Vishnu in Deoghar, Uttar Pradesh in India. This is a panel that shows Vishnu dreaming the universe. It was created between about 450 and 500 CE. So, according to ancient Sanskrit texts, the creation and existence of the universe is directly dependent on the god Vishnu. So Vishnu in the Hindu pantheon is a benevolent god. He works for order and well-being. He's usually depicted with 4 arms and wearing a cylindrical crown. Sometimes he's shown riding a man-bird creature named Garuda, but more often he's shown as he is here, sort of reclining, depicted in a deep trance in which he is dreaming the world into existence. So, according to Hindu texts, Vishnu is sheltered by the great serpent of infinity named Ananta, and Vishnu sleeps on the cosmic sea. Now, during this sleep, the universe is destroyed and reborn over and over on into eternity. So in this particular relief, Vishnu is shown sort of sleeping on the great serpent itself. The goddess Lakshmi down here holds onto his foot. She is sort of his wife or female consort. She represents the female side of his energy, but she's also the goddess of wealth, fertility, and beauty. The unity of Lakshmi and Vishnu creates a partnership that results in the birth of a new universe again and again on into eternity. So here, Vishnu is shown dreaming again the universe into existence. And you might notice he's connected sort of through this vine or sort of smoke-like element to this other figure. So this is Vishnu dreaming the god Brahma into existence. So Brahma is, here at least, the active agent of creation, featured there at the center top. He's shown meditating on a lotus blossom, though sometimes he's shown growing kind of directly out of Vishnu's navel. You can see 3 of Brahma's 4 faces here. He has 4 heads that symbolize the 4 cosmic cycles, the 4 earthly directions, or the 4 classes of society, which includes priests or Brahmins, warriors, merchants, and laborers. And Brahma is considered the god of spiritual wisdom. Now, to the left of Brahma, we have the god, we have the god Shiva, who rides a bull named Nandi. Shiva embodies the dualities of the universe. So things like male and female, good and evil, things that are typically opposite but sort of paired together in this case. Shiva is considered both benevolent and fearsome, and both a giver and taker of life. He's both creator and destroyer, And in the Hindu sort of pantheon and cosmology, destruction is considered necessary for creation. So Vishnu and Shiva both are considered sort of responsible for the never-ending cycle of existence. So Shiva is responsible for dancing the world into existence and generating what's known as samsara, the endless cycle of death and rebirth. So here we have an 11th century cast sculpture. This is Shiva as Natharaja, or the Lord of the Dance. So here he's shown dancing within the orb of the sun. So this circle surrounding the figure here, this is the orb of the sun. He's tapping on a small drum in one hand. This is called the damaru, and it marks the cosmic rhythm of the death and rebirth cycle. The flames that surround Shiva are representative of the periodic chaos and destruction that happens when the dance ceases. And so during that inactivity, fire is said to cleanse the world and provide a release from the samsara. Shiva is also shown dancing on top of a sort of dwarf demon here. This symbolizes that evil and ignorance are stamped out during Shiva's dance. And the dance also creates a balance between forces of creation and destruction that over time sort of result in that cycle of life. Now, again, you might notice we have 4 arms on Shiva here. The front arms are creating what's called a mudra, or a gesture of meaning. This one in particular symbolizes have no fear. And then again, tapping on the drum and sort of holding up the orb of the sun, but also holding a sort of fireball in the hand there. The raised foot signifies liberation. So the stance and the sort of action being portrayed are both indicative of Shiva's powers. This was made with the lost wax casting technique. If you remember, we talked about that a couple weeks ago. And this kind of statue was really intended to be moved, which is why it's of a pretty moderate size, only about 44 inches tall. So from about the 11th century onward, Hindu devotees carried these kinds of statues in processional parades. They were sort of followed along by priests who would chant prayers, and statues like this would have been sort of carried maybe on a sort of palanquin. You can see it has holes in the base here to be perhaps attached. That way it might not fall off such a palanquin. Oftentimes these statues would be given clothes or jewelry, maybe flowers for the parades, but the statue acts as a place for Shiva to rest, so he is present during the festivities. Visual arts have often been used to illustrate the beginnings of specific civilizations as well. So here we have a work from the Aztecs, or the Mexica, as they call themselves. These peoples inhabited central sort of Mesoamerica from about 900 to 1521 CE. They originally lived in a city called Aztlan, which was probably a real place somewhere in the Mesoamerican desert, but we don't know exactly where. The name Aztecs comes from that Aztlan name, although Aztec wasn't a common name for these people until about the 18th century. Like I said, they called themselves the Mexica. So in about 1325, the Aztecs founded their capital city of Tenochtitlan in central Mexico. According to legends and accounts of the Aztecs, their patron deity Huitzilopochtli told them to leave their homeland in search of a new one, which he would point out to them when they came upon it. So again, according to the legend, for about 200 years, the Aztec people underwent what was called the Long Migration, in which they searched for their new homeland. This migration was fraught with conflict and battles, and during one such battle, the warriors cut out the heart of an enemy and tossed it into a nearby lake. Later, they were passing by that same spot, and they saw an eagle perched on a cactus clutching a rattlesnake within its talons, which was the sign that their patron deity had told them to look for. And so this became their new home, Tenochtitlan. So this is a single sheet of paper, likely created sometime between 15 and 1600, but it shows the alleged path of migration of the Mexica people to Tenochtitlan during their 200-year-long migration. And here we can see a map of Tenochtitlan, their new homeland. So this map, probably created in about 1524, Tenochtitlan was a city on an island in the middle of Lake Texcoco. The Aztecs constructed causeways that connected the city to the mainland. It sort of expanded and absorbed several of its neighbors and became one of the largest cities in the world. It had a population of about 250,000 people, which was twice the size of the city of London at the same time. Portions of the island city really seem to have been built on a grid system, which you can kind of tell here in this illustration. And this city was quite advanced. They had a zoo, botanical gardens, and a sacred center that featured the famous Temple Mayor. Unfortunately, we no longer have the Temple Mayor or very much of Tenochtitlan at all. It is, in fact, underneath present-day Mexico City. Mexico City was built on top of the remains of Tenochtitlan. There are a lot of original artifacts and building materials around, but many of those have been kind of used for more contemporary projects. So we may never truly know all of the history that surrounds this city. Here we have the Aztec calendar stone, sometimes called the Aztec sunstone. This once stood at the top of the main temple in Tenochtitlan, the Temple Mayor. Now, your book discusses this work in section 4.4, Art and Science. The Aztecs were incredibly skillful observers of the sky. This work sort of shows their astronomical and their mathematical knowledge, but it also shows how these people marked the passage of time, and it shows the beliefs about the cycles of life that they carried. So this was made, we think, around the beginning of the 16th century, about 1502, 1521. It weighs 24 tons and it is 12 feet across, so it is quite large. It was originally painted with brown, red, white, blue, and green. And the carvings here illustrate the belief that the earth endures reoccurring cycles of destruction and creation. It shows in the center here the sun god Tonatiuh. We have clawed hands that are sort of holding human hearts on either side of the kind of face here. Aztecs made frequent human and animal sacrifices to the sun god to perpetuate the sun's continued movement. They saw the sun as, the giver of all life, and so they gave sacrificial offerings. They gave life in order to sustain life. Now, around the sun god at the center there, we have these 4 squares. Each of these frame symbols that represent the 4 ways in which the world had previously come to an end. So the Aztecs believed that there had been different eras of the world at their point, 4 of them at that point, and they had each ended in a different type of destruction. So first by wind, then fire, floods, and wild beasts. The Aztecs believed that their current era, the 5th era, would be destroyed by earthquake. So the rings around these show the 20 symbols that represent the days of the Aztec month. And it might make for an interesting comparison if we look at Shiva as Lord of the Dance and the Aztec sunstone or calendar stone together. Both are circular and both refer to these ideas of birth and rebirth, or of destruction and creation. and both refer to ideas of destruction or death bringing about new life in various ways. Visual artists also often explore the physical beginnings and endings of life, so birth and death, and the sort of physical process of aging that happens in between. So here we have another Aztec work. This is the Aztec goddess Tlazolteotl. She is considered the Earth Mother and patron of childbirth. Amongst the Aztecs, a woman giving birth was seen as a female warrior going into battle on behalf of the state. So women who died during childbirth were given the same sort of honor as a man who died during battle. They resided in the same final resting place as heroes and accompanied the sun on its daily journey through the sky. And so the goddess here is shown sort of giving birth. You can see she has this strained grimace of pain, as well as a sort of fearsome, perhaps intimidating expression. Again, women giving birth seen as warriors, so we have that correlation here. Sort of an interesting juxtaposition of meaning, though, because this goddess was also known as the filth eater. Not only was she responsible for sort of creation and birth, but she actually also visited people at the ends of their lives to devour their sins before they entered the afterlife. And contemporary artists continue to explore similar ideas and themes. Here we have a 1994 work from the Dutch photographer Runike Dykstra. They highlight the stark realities of physical birth in their Mothers series. This one is Julie from the Netherlands from February 29th, 1994. It shows the mother and her newborn child just 1 hour after delivery, kind of pictured at a time and in a way that really defies typical expectations of mother and child imagery. They're positioned against a cold, anonymous wall, looking very vulnerable with their nudity, maybe even sort of shocked by the traumatic experience that they have just undergone. The artist was inspired by watching the birth of her friend's baby. She really wanted to capture both the awkwardness and the enduring strength of these early moments of new life. In the same year that Dykstra photographed the new mothers, she also photographed matadors in Portugal just after they had come out of the ring. And like these new mothers, the bullfighters had been sort of emotionally charged and in these potentially life-threatening situations. And both the mothers and the matadors are captured in a state of sort of physical and emotional catharsis, which contributes to the intensity of their engagement with the photographer and the camera, and therefore the viewer. The invention of time has helped humanity mark the cycles we experience within nature for centuries. And the most obvious of those cycles being the rotation of the Earth around the sun. A standard understanding of time exists today, but throughout history, different cultures have used diverse systems, some of which are linear, while others are more cyclical. We talked just a moment ago about the Aztec sunstone or calendar stone, but there are other markers of sort of natural cycles that associate with the seasons or astronomical cycles, but we'll look at those in the next lecture with art and nature. For now, I want to look at this medieval book of hours. So this is a work by the Limburg brothers. And so a medieval book of hours was meant to track the months of the year and the times of the day. It showed images that were to be meditated on during prayer, and these were awfully sort of richly decorated and highly detailed. And Typically, these would contain sets of prayers to be sort of said during different times of the day, as well as a calendar of holy days and devotional texts and other sort of various spiritual or religious information. Each month of the year typically included a timely sort of narrative scene. This particular book of hours, it was designed for the Duc de Berry. And so each month depicts a scene of the Duke and his court, the peasants, etc., kind of in or in the area surrounding his castle and his lands. So on this particular slide, we have the months of July, August, and September from this book of hours. In July, we have the chateau sort of in the background. You can see the drawbridge and the banisters with kind of lookout towers there. Out in the lands in front of the chateau, we have peasants and harvesters with sickles out reaping wheat, as well as shepherds amongst their sheep. Then in the August scene in the middle there, we can see again the chateau in the background, but a little farther away. We have peasants harvesting, and in sort of the middle ground there, we have some other peasants bathing in the sort of stream. And in the foreground, we have aristocratic individuals, and it seems like maybe they are headed away from the chateau off on a hunt, maybe to go hawking with their hunting birds. And then on the last panel here, we have September. And so again, the palace or the chateau in the background, but in sort of the middle and foreground here, we have grapes being harvested to make the region's most celebrated wine. So each panel at the top has a hemisphere that shows the solar chariot with the sun god Phoebus, sort of at its appropriate spot for that month of the year. And there's also the relevant signs of the zodiac. So we have featured here Cancer, Leo, Virgo, and Libra. Here are a couple more from this particular book of hours. These are some of the winter months. We have February on the left and January on the right. And you notice on the left, we have a depiction of the lower class, maybe peasants, we could call them. And then on the right, we have the Duke of Berry himself sort of having this elaborate feast in front of very kind of highly decorated tapestries of war. So we have this interesting comparison between the lower class individuals who seem to be pretty relatively content with their kind of hardworking life. They have a nice little farm, but also they seem perhaps a bit lowly or uncivilized in comparison to the elaborate feast of the Duke on the opposite page. So I'm thinking about how various cycles of life affect various stages of civilization or various levels of class differently. Thomas Cole was an American artist in the late 19th, early 20th century. He was quite intent on using the genre of landscape painting to communicate universal truths about human existence, religious faith, and the natural world. So here we have his series, The Voyage of Life. It contains 4 works and sort of traces a religious journey of an archetypal everyman along what is called the River of Life, which sort of flows through each of the 4 canvases, reflecting life's various twists and turns, while the seasons and times of day in the various canvases depict or mirror different stages of life. So on the top left there, we have childhood, with this golden boat that emerges from a dark cave. Caves being a sort of mysterious source of birth or creation from the earth, that is. We have a happy young child or infant reaching out towards the world in wonder, kind of highlighting maybe innocence or naivety, bathed in a bit of a rosy light. We have a background scene of quite a fertile, sort of beautiful landscape and an angelic figure that guides the boat forward. Now below that, again on the left, we have youth, where a boy takes control of the boat, sort of oblivious to the increasing turbulence of the river. He strikes out boldly towards this aerial castle, sort of floating in the distance. This is symbolic of, excuse me, symbolic of adolescent ambition towards fame and glory, perhaps. Um, on the top right, we have the third canvas, manhood. Here we have nature's fury and demons and self-doubt that are plaguing man. He's still in the boat. You can see the waters are much more turbulent. He's approaching some rapids. So here we have the man sort of losing control over his life in adulthood. The angel now watches from above as the man hurtles towards those sort of violent rapids and rocks, kind of implying that only divine intervention could help him now. And lastly, on the bottom right, we have the fourth and final canvas in this series, Old Age. So we have a stream that sort of, or rather the stream of life has sort of reached its destination, the ocean of eternity, where the man floats on his broken vessel. All signs of nature and the sort of corporeal or terrestrial existence have been cast aside. The man sees his guardian angel for the first time and kind of gazes towards that soft light off in the distance, which again is representative of eternity. So very symbolic kind of representation of the journey of life, or the stages of life here. We could also talk about Edvard Munch's Frieze of Life series. Munch was a Norwegian artist. He's quite iconic for both modern art and expressionist art, or the expressionist movement. Munch created a substantial body of work from around the turn of the 19th century that really gives shape to his inner life and the psyche of modern humanity. Many of these works feature images of existential dread, anxiety, loneliness, complex emotions of human sexuality and of aging, and they're sort of varied in their content. So typically in sketches and paintings, pastels, and other prints, he sort of taps into the depths of his feelings in order to examine the major motifs or the stages of life as he sees them. Kind of exploring hopelessness of love and anxiety, jealousy, again, separation in life and death. Ultimately, this culminates in what he called the frieze of life. This series full of life's tragedies as the artist struggled with his mental and physical health as well as that of his family. So this canvas from 1899 is titled The Child and Death. He does several versions of this and several other works that deal with the complexities of death and grief. This particular one features a small girl kind of holding her hands over her ears. In the background, we can see her deceased mother lying in the bed, and other family members or friends sort of coming to pay their respects. So it's not so much focused on the deceased character themselves, but rather on the emotional or psychological condition of those who have been left behind. So the main theme here is really the child's grief and pain, maybe even the child's confusion at the situation that is going on. Not illustrated with tears or sadness necessarily, but really through pure terror. Here on the left, we have the sick child. So again, kind of this idea of illness as well as grief. This one particularly draws on Munch's memories of his own sister Sophie's death from tuberculosis at the age of 15. So the model for this canvas was a young girl that Munch saw sitting sort of distraught within his father's doctor's office. She was there to get treatment for her brother's broken leg, and she was very emotional. Um, this canvas features a rapid brushwork and sort of vivid greens and reds, really suggesting the traumatic memory. Now on the right side, we have a canvas from 1894, excuse me. This is titled Puberty. So slightly different, but still thinking about the passage of time, the various stages or cycles of life. We have this nude figure staring directly out of the viewer, kind of perched on the edge of this bed, um, almost seemingly trying to cover herself. Kind of depicts the awkwardness of puberty, but also of being on display during puberty or during a young age, and perhaps even reflects some of Munch's own repressed sexuality or emotions. We have this sort of dark shadow that looms there on the wall, kind of a creepy or ambiguous form. It sort of lends to this sense of isolation and loneliness, but also an uneasiness or a fear of the unknown or a fear of what is to come, kind of a confusion about life's natural progression. Um, and of course, we have Munch's most iconic work, The Scream. This is one of several versions. And here he's giving a lot of symbolism, but really being quite expressionistic as well. So we have a bridge that extends at a rather steep angle um, against the landscape of a shoreline, of maybe a lake, probably a fjord, though remember he was from the Netherlands. And then in the background, we have the hills and the sky made up of these sort of harsh, swirling colors and lines that really echo the remainder of the landscape in a rather haunting way. Munch published this in a Parisian magazine in 1895, along with the text that stated, "I stopped and leaned against the balustrade, almost dead with fatigue. Above the black-blue fjord hung the clouds, red as blood and tongues of fire. My friends had left me, and alone, trembling with anguish, I became aware of the vast, infinite cry of nature." So again, really thinking about various stages of life, both within sort of human existence, but within the natural world as well, and really trying to illustrate his internal emotions through these external art forms. And so Munch and other artists really think about sort of universal experiences that occur throughout our lifetimes. So here we have Kathy Kollwitz, also a German expressionist. Um, and death and suffering are pretty prominent themes within much of her art. She experienced a lot of loss in her life as the result of World War I and II, which included the personal loss of her friends and her son, as well as the losses of other mothers and children, the poor in the area, etc. So on the left, we have A Woman with Dead Child from 1903. Kollwitz's husband was a doctor, and he treated really the poorest of the poor in Berlin at the time, in an area where disease and the childhood, excuse me, the childhood mortality rate were quite high. And so she was really inspired by these things and wanted to make works that sort of spoke to those feelings of grief and of loss. So here we have a sort of dense network of fine lines and this shadowy texture that dramatize this grieving mother as she sort of clutches her dead child. Kollwitz used herself and her son, who was 7 at the time, as models for this work. Um, on the right, we have Death and Woman from 1910. This nude female figure is sort of sandwiched between a skeletal figure of death behind her, who sort of pins her arms to her sides, and then a young child who sort of claws at the woman's breasts, almost as if the woman is being torn from the world of the living by death, or perhaps the woman is feeling torn between the two worlds. Kollwitz's son Peter died in 1914, and this was really the single most influential event on her and her work. The themes of grief have been amplified here as she conceived this work as a memorial for Peter's grave. Um, it took her 18 years to complete this composition. She began working a few years after her son's death, but finished this in totality in 1932. Um, Typically, her works are lithograph prints, sometimes etchings, but here she's experimenting with woodcut printing. She's given us a portrayal of her and her husband grieving for their son. The father kneels, covering his own face, but also supporting his wife as she leans sort of onto him, burying her face within the crook of his arm there. Um, we have these lines that are rather jagged and sort of expressive of the raw suffering of these parents, but also kind of indicative of the medium and the materials being used, right? You might notice the hands, particularly, well, the hands of the father are those that are visible, rather exaggerated or enlarged, as are the heads of the figures. So, kind of highlighting those aspects to really communicate the emotions and um, the gravity of suffering and grief in these personalized depictions of her own experience. And again, grief and loss are universal experiences. And oftentimes we have this sort of common human wish to talk to those who are no longer with us, to speak to those who have died or already passed on in order to ask advice or guidance, or perhaps compare experiences, or simply tell them what's happened since they've gone and that we miss them. So here we have a work by Meta Warwick Fuller from 1937. Fuller's work, Talking Skull, really depicts that wish. So here we have a young man kneeling nude, so rather vulnerable here, and sort of kneeling over this skull. And if you notice the facial expression, the mouth sort of parted, the brows bunched, slight tilt of the head, really kind of communicates this idea that he's really interacting with this skull, um, almost as if he's hearing those who have passed on speak at this very moment, as if he's receiving an answer to his question, or that his wish to talk to the dead has been granted at this very moment. And Fuller was a pioneering African American artist. She was born in 1877. So this is also a very specifically African American work that addresses the traumatic rupture of ancestral culture that the slave trade caused. And it sort of seeks to help Black Americans reconnect and find pride within their African heritage. Here we have a stop motion animation music video for a 2014 song by the artist James titled Moving On. So stop motion animation, or stop frame animation, is a technique that uses physically manipulated objects, similar to how singular film stills are kind of run together to make it appear as if the images are moving. These physical objects are manipulated in order to appear like they are moving on their own. So the object that is being recorded is moved in small increments between each of the individually photographed frames. And this creates that illusion of continuous movement when they're played together. Often these types of animation use clay, so claymation, or dolls, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. So In this work, the song was written by Tim Booth. He wrote it about the death of his own mother. And then the stop motion animation video was created by Anseli Henderson. So she walked past a Scottish woolen knitwear shop and saw this ball of wool at the line. Um, and she was thinking about how time is always unwinding. And she had all of these deadlines within her mind that were just sort of continuously rolling along. Um, so she starts to think about life as a line or time as a line, like a timeline, and then starts to apply that to the life of the human, and incorporate these ideas of interconnectedness. And with the use of yarn, we have kind of this um, implication of the tying together of things, perhaps the tying together of various stages of life or of life and death. And often that occurs in a sort of cyclical fashion. So I'll post a link to this video on our Blackboard page so you can check it out. And oftentimes, when thinking about the cycle of life as a theme in visual art, we see artists turning to stories or histories for their subjects. So they pull especially from histories and stories whose roots run rather deep into a culture or community's collective memory, in order to sort of communicate things about that culture or community over time, or how things have changed or evolved over time. So amongst the Native American Great Plains Indians, plainsmen often recorded their exploits on teepees and buffalo hides that were worn. So this particular one is a buffalo robe that was presented to Lewis and Clark during their transcontinental expedition. And it illustrates a battle fought in 1797 by the Mandan, of what is now North Dakota, and the Sioux Indians. So here we have horses shown in profile with stick legs and C-shaped hooves. This is also a great example of what the equipment these people would have used at the time might have looked like. We can see headdresses, sashes, shields, as well as feathered lances and gunpowder horns. The leader can be seen at the bottom with an eagle feathered headdress and a pipe, which marks him out as a man of rank. Um, and so to create this, the painter would have pressed lines into the hide and then filled forms in with black, red, green, yellow, and brown. And so again, this is a robe that was meant to be worn. It would have sort of been draped over the shoulders of the warrior whose deeds that it commemorates. Um, Again, as a sort of a record of the passage of time, or perhaps a record of the events of that particular warrior's life. Um, this one also happens to have porcupine quills incorporated in a line down the center of the robe, sort of down the buffalo spine. Here is a Blackfoot buffalo robe, so another one that would have been meant to be sort of worn. It's painted with images of the owner, who is shown in a yellow shirt and war bonnet. He's actually shown several times. So, um, starting here, kind of on the left, he's shown in various scenes, shown with a woman, shown firing arrows from behind a wounded horse. Then in the scene where this one's kind of blown up here, he's shown with scalps of his enemies, then with a pipe, wearing a necklace, maybe a bear claw. He's shown 8 times total. So again, these are various events that occurred throughout the lifetime of the owner of the robe, kind of serving as a personal history, as well as a cultural history. The Lakota Native Americans kept their histories or calendars on hides, which they called Waneatu Wawapi. So Waneatu means year. It's measured from, or at least by the Lakota, it's measured from the first snowfall to the first snowfall. So the word Vanuatu is often translated as winter, which makes sense because these people were living in what is now the Dakotas, so winter would have been um, sort of important, or at least something that needed to be considered. Um, and so Wawapi means anything that is marked which can be read or counted. So the literal translation of Vanuatu Wawapi is winter counts. So we call these Lakota winter counts. These are sort of used in conjunction with a more extensive oral history, but each year is named for a particular event that occurred during that year. And the pictures on these winter counts refer to the year's names. Each Lakota band had a winter count keeper, a community historian who added a new image to the winter count each year. Typically, this was a man, and it was often passed down through the generations of men. Though in the 20th century, it began to be passed down to some women in some cases as well. Winter counts would be copied when the hide wore out or they needed more space. And typically these were named after the last winter count keeper. So on the left we have Lone Dog's winter count. So the winter count keeper's name was Lone Dog. And this particular winter count details the years 1800 to 1871. On the right, we have the subsequent winter count after Lone Dog here, this one by Black Bear or Matosapo, from about 1900. And you can see in both, the years are recorded as spirals, which is sort of interesting. Again, we can think about that sort of cyclical nature of life, of death and kind of rebirth, or destruction and renewal. We could also think about the cyclical nature of the changing of seasons, winter becoming spring, maybe even the migration cycles of animals that would have been hunted by these people, etc. So by the 1860s, traders and military men from Europe had brought non-native drawing materials like paper, lined ledger books, pencils, crayons, and ink to the Plains Indians. So in the mid-late 19th century, Plains Indians began creating what we call ledger drawings, simply because they are drawings created on ledger paper. These are very similar to the drawings we see on buffalo robes. They tend to sort of memorialize deeds with pictures that would have been kind of discussed in oral recollections or histories detailing bravery and battle. Sometimes they feature scenes of warfare or ceremonies, maybe common courting practices, or even spiritual visions. But really, they chronicle key events from a way of life that was rapidly changing. So this is a ledger drawing by the artist Frank Henderson. He was an Arapaho artist, and this is titled Off to War. This tells the story of his people, the Arapaho Indians, who lived in the mountains and plains of the western United States until Anglo-American invasion forced them onto reservations in Oklahoma Territory in 1867. The recorded history of the Arapaho as their horse-based culture was sort of converted to an agrarian society and confined to reservation lands. So Henderson has depicted two warriors leaving for battle, wearing traditional regalia as their horses sort of charge forward. And again, the Plains Indians have a very long tradition of preserving oral histories pictorially. Again, on teepees or buffalo robes. But after moving to these reservations, they switched to ledgers, these books that were bound, intended for use by white settlers to record financial transactions. And so ledger art becomes a version of recorded history for the communities, and it really remains important for understanding the histories of Native Americans. Here we have a series of ledger drawings created by Bear's Heart at Fort Marion in St. Augustine, Florida, between 1875 and 78. So 72 Native men from various tribes were imprisoned for their involvement in the Red Rivers Wars in Indian Territory in Oklahoma. And they were imprisoned at Fort Marion in Florida. There, they were encouraged by their captors to draw, and they produced hundreds of drawings. And many of these show battles and ceremonies, but Bearhart's drawings in particular are more sort of personal. They detail his own journey from the Great Plains to imprisonment in Florida. He features 24 different scenes using pencil and crayon, some of them showing sort of traditional Cheyenne camps or experiences like Cheyenne amongst the buffalo. Excuse me. But then on the right, you can see some of the maybe non-traditional or perhaps modernized scenes that he encountered on his journey here. This ledger drawing is by the Kiowa artist Woha, and it's titled Between Two Worlds. So after the Civil War, the exploration and settlement of the Great Plains really rapidly increased. And that resulted in the simultaneous increase in conflicts between the U.S. military and the Native Americans of the plains. In 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad was completed, and within about 15 years, the plains buffalo had been hunted to near extinction. So traditions of painting on buffalo hides or using them for teepees started to decrease, whereas the use of paper or canvas for teepees was on the rise. So here, Woha is sort of depicting himself caught between these two worlds, between his traditional native world and the new sort of increasingly westernized world. So he's shown in the middle of the canvas, or excuse me, in the middle of the composition here, and he's holding out offerings of peace pipes on either side, one to a buffalo and one to a domesticated beef cow. His feet are sort of positions. One is on a teepee and the other is on a framed house in a plowed field. So again, kind of thinking about those two different worlds. Overhead, we have celestial bodies as if Woha is seeking supernatural guidance while he is caught between these two worlds, really thinking about peace and resolution and all of the change that is occurring around him. And so, speaking of change, the probably most universal experience of humanity is the process of aging, right? Everyone is sort of born, they aged through childhood, through puberty, on into adulthood, into their sort of senior years, and then on into death, right? Pretty much no matter who you are or where you're from, this is going to happen to you. It is the nature of humanity. Now, various cultures and various artists deal with this concept in different ways. This is an example of how the Northern Wei dynasty sort of thought about the process of aging and the various stages of life. And so this is a panel from a sarcophagus made about 1500 years ago, and it deals with themes of filial piety. In Confucian philosophy, filial piety means loyalty or respect for one's aging parents, elders, and ancestors. It involved the honoring of a family name as well as the emphasis on group harmony over individual identity. So on this particular sarcophagus, we have small cartouches with titles of each of these various stories kind of featured across the larger panel here. The two scenes are kind of divided by a black zigzagging line, which is actually an outcropping of rocks in kind of a central position within this larger landscape. And so this is somewhat of a continuous narrative in that we have various moments from a sort of longer story depicted throughout a single composition. So um, our main character, Wangu, you can see him a couple different times. He's the figure that has two top knots. He's shown on both sides of that central zigzagging rock. Um, but Wangu's family was rather poor. They were agriculturists who worked in the fields. And it's the story here is the story of Wangu's grandfather, who had become so old that he could no longer work within the fields. So Wangu's father decided that they needed to get rid of the grandfather. They carried him out to the wilderness. You can see that on the right side. They have him sort of balanced on this sort of litter, carrying him over to leave him by this stream, which is kind of at the center of this second scene. Then we have Wangu carrying the litter back and his father walking along beside him. Um, Eventually, his father notices that Wangu is still carrying that litter, and he says something like, "Why are you still carrying that hateful thing?" And Wangu responds, "Well, so that I have it to carry you out here when you're old." And so the father quickly realizes his own lack of filial piety, and decides, come what may, they must keep and care for the grandfather, because um, the Confucian philosophy of sort of respecting and honoring your elders, right? Um, and so in this belief system, how you live your life is an indication of your filial piety. So sort of a fitting subject to be featured on a sarcophagus, because filial piety is something that is expected even after the passing of your parents. So it carries over to the honor and reverence of the ancestors. And really, lineage and ancestors, these are quite important to sort of exploring and finding one's own place within the world, as well as sort of their connections to the past. Um, at the death of an ancestor in China, a portrait would be made for the purpose of their veneration. So here we have a portrait of Yong Ching Emperor. He reigned between 1722 and 1735. Um, it shows his sort of power and wealth. He sits upon this gilded throne wearing rich textiles. The seat has a sort of luxurious cushion, and the carpet is rather rich as well. We have dragons stitched onto his robe, showing power. But this portrait was made at his death to be hung within a family shrine. The ruler's descendants would burn incense and bow before their ancestor's portrait, asking for protection and guidance. And so ancestor veneration is common across many cultures. And in China, family shrines continue today. There's typically a day in which people make offerings to sustain the ancestors within the afterlife. Regular offerings of food, drink, and spirit money are given. And there's also a special holiday called the King Ming Festival. This is sort of a ghost festival where big offerings are made, larger offerings of spirit money and food, things like that. But we see the veneration of the ancestors in other cultures too. For example, the Day of the Dead celebration in Mexico. This has roots amongst the Aztec and the Mayan civilizations. The Day of the Dead is considered a day for people to visit the graves of their loved ones. They adorn them with offerings of food, flowers, and essentially create temporary art installations for the purpose of connecting the living to the dead. The Osmat peoples on the island of New Guinea in the Pacific Ocean create objects called beast poles, which represent both indications of the cyclical nature of human life, as well as local and familial ties that connect the community. These works are made for collective funerary feasts. They are sort of representations of dead individuals, but also of the ancestors kind of as a whole. So the lower part of the beast pole is called the canoe. It's considered to be their soul ship that carries the dead into the afterlife. At the top, you can see we have this sort of wing-like projection. So these beast poles are typically carved from sago palms, and one root from the palm is retained to keep that sort of projection there. Beast poles were once made in association with headhunting and warfare, but that is sort of out of practice now. But they continue to serve a ritual function within male initiations and memorial festivals. They illustrate this sort of profound bond between the figures carved and the trees they come from. The trees are considered just as important as the relationships between the generations of ancestors. Once the beast pole has served its ritual function, it is returned to the grove of sago palms that it was taken from and left to decay. So this process of, or rather this natural process of decay kind of represents those cycles of life, but it also serves to bring a sort of spiritual strength to the new generations of trees, in the same way that ancestor veneration brings a new strength to younger generations. Artists have also long contemplated their own death and mortality. And a great example of this, we've talked a bit about before, are what are known as Venitus. This is a type of still life painting that became very popular in the 17th century during the Northern Baroque period, so amongst the Dutch in the Netherlands. So Venitus refers to the word vanity, right? And these were often coupled with Memento Mori imagery. So they serve to sort of remind the viewer of the transience or brevity of life, the futility of worldly pleasure, and the certainty of death. Again, vanitas meaning vanity, sort of referring to excessive pride in or maybe admiration of worldly appearances, achievements, possessions. So these types of paintings are meant to highlight the sort of worthlessness of material objects and physical limitations in favor of spiritual ones or the afterlife. These also gave artists a great opportunity to show off their skills. They could paint beautiful objects using trompe-l'oeil techniques, but they also incorporated moral justifications. So Peter Claes is one of the first, one of the first Dutch still life painters. This is his Venitas. Well, he did several of them, but this is one. It features a skull, so a pretty obvious memento mori, or a reminder of the fragility of life and the inevitability of mortality. We also have within this canvas a burning, or rather a candle that has recently been burning. This is sort of an oil lamp. We have this soft wisp of smoke kind of floating upwards, symbolizing perhaps life being snuffed out. The books can represent human curiosity and knowledge, as well as the limitations or temporary nature of human curiosity and knowledge. The glass next to the skull has been tipped over, symbolizing the fleeting pleasures, or perhaps the fact that the glass is empty could represent death itself, and glass as a material sort of connotes fragility, so the fragility of life. Here's another one, this one titled Still Life with Taza. A taza being this silver sort of dish here. This one is a breakfast scene. These were pretty common amongst the Venitas genre, kind of featuring meals of bread, fruit, and nuts. The monochromatic scene has kind of a max of contrasting textures We get a strong sense of space created with the diagonal placement of the table here. The plate kind of positioned on the edge of that table, the orange peel kind of spiraling down into the foreground or the space kind of in front of the table. The knife has been balanced on the edge of that plate there, and displaying a nice use of foreshortening by the artist here. And so, what is the meaning here? Well, we have kind of this sense of perhaps, again, vulnerability, mortality, the fleeting nature of life. So the glass not turned over this time, but not empty either. Really displaying the artist's skill with transparency and light, but still also evoking that idea of fragility, even if it is filled and kind of implying that life is not yet over. We have next to it that taza, again, that sort of silver dish. This one is turned over, so we have that reference to fleeting pleasures or the brevity of life. And it sort of seems as if this breakfast has been interrupted. So as if there was someone seated here enjoying their breakfast, and for whatever reason they've had to jump up and quickly leave, and kind of leaving things sort of haphazardly on the table here. So thinking about the passage of time and how at any moment life can be interrupted or sort of abruptly stopped, perhaps, and yet the world continues to move on around you. Here's one more by Klaus. This one, we have a skull in the background, so another obvious sort of Memento Mori, which, remember, that phrase sort of literally translates to remember you must die, so a reminder that death is inevitable for humanity. We have that tipped over glass again, this one kind of similar to that one we saw in the first example there. Next to it, a cracked walnut, again, kind of indicating that there was a person here enjoying this wine and food, but now they've gone. The instrument, the violin there, sort of reminds us of the transience of music. It's not fixed in time and will at some point end. But notice on the left-hand side, sort of behind that timepiece there, we have a glass orb or kind of ball, and a reflection of the scene within it, including the artist creating the scene. So you can sort of see, let me turn on my laser here. You can see the artist working at his canvas in the reflection. This sort of acts as a challenge to death in the way that because the artist is being depicted, they will live on through their work even after they have physically died. But it's also a great display of the artist's virtuosity and skill as well. And here we have a work by Pablo Picasso from 1932, really demonstrating an awareness of art historical traditions, specifically of the Venitus genre, but also of Renaissance or Baroque depictions of the goddess Venus, the goddess of love and beauty, gazing at herself in a mirror. So the subject of kind of looking at oneself in a mirror, specifically relating to women oftentimes, kind of speaks to the tradition of Venitus, because physical beauty is ephemeral. It's destined to fade over time. Traditionally, mirrors and painting symbolize the desire of the artist to recreate nature in its most sort of lifelike state. But Picasso here has really incorporated a cubist abstraction rather than a trompe-l'oeil illusionism. So he has depicted this woman who gazes at herself in a mirror, and notice the difference between the woman on the left and the reflection on the right. The reflection is sort of dark and chaotic. Potentially, this could be read as a depiction of the unavoidable future. Perhaps her physical beauty has faded and she's seeing that, or perhaps this is supposed to be representative of her inevitable death. Audrey Flack was a photorealist artist who was also inspired by the Dutch Venitus tradition. Here, she's commenting on human mortality and creating an homage to the actress Marilyn Monroe. So on the right, you can see the photo of Marilyn Monroe there. It's being reflected in the mirror that's positioned on the left side of the composition. This is sort of showing us Marilyn Monroe's public persona as an actress or celebrity. And again, that mirror symbolizes the transience of youth and beauty and life. But the other objects speak to that as well. We have a calendar, a clock, an hourglass, all sort of representative of the passage of time and serving as reminders of the brevity of life. The burning candle, the flower, and the fruit, all of these will only last a short while. They're temporary. The fruit and the flower are natural. They will decay. The candle will sort of diminish the longer the flame burns. So again, referencing the passage of time and the brevity of life. Flack has used hyper-realistic colors and these sort of floating objects. You can see it really well with this paintbrush here. Kind of floats. You can see the shadow it casts on the book in the background. But really adding a kind of dramatic, supernatural, or sort of otherworldly feel to this work. She's also included a portrait or a photograph of herself and her brother as children, reminding herself as well as the viewer that the pleasures of life are fleeting, excuse me, and of the fact that we age, etc. We also have items like a compact mirror, lipstick, blush and perfume, pearls. These are to refer to, again, worldly possessions, as well as kind of physical beauty and the fleeting nature of such things. We've looked at this work a bit previously, Andre Mantegna's Dead Christ, from about 1480. We talked about this in our discussion of perspective, I believe. We discussed sort of this extreme foreshortening of the figure, right? But this is also a great example of how Renaissance artists often depicted images of the damaged body of Christ after crucifixion. This sort of emphasizes the miraculous nature of the resurrection, but it also kind of brings about this idea of the eternal life that is to come after physical death, which is really the core of Christianity, right? So the artist has given us this very kind of direct and intimate view of the dead Christ. And yes, it has these kind of spiritual implications, ideas of afterlife, and, the idea that even after physical life, the spirit lives on. But this is also a nice kind of exploration of the human body going through the process of dying as well. And sort of similarly, we have Andre Serrano's series, The Morgue. This is a series from 1992 in which the artist photographed in a morgue and took photos of subjects that he only identified by the manner of their deaths. I think at this point in time, humanity is a bit more detached from death than they once were. People don't generally die at home as often. Rather, they're in hospitals or perhaps like a nursing home or a senior care living situation. And images of the deceased are not really very common, whereas in the past, depending on the time period, they were quite common and popular. Bodies are not prepared by family members, but by hired services. So really, as living individuals, we're sort of separated from the natural process of death in a way that we haven't always been. So Serrano here is sort of reacquainting us with those processes. Again, photographing subjects in the morgue and only identifying them by the manner of their death. This one is gun murder, so we know that this particular individual died. They were murdered, not just they died of natural causes, so that sort of changes the emotional message, perhaps. The feet are pointed away from us, sort of the opposite of Mantegna's Dead Christ, right? And then we have this dark black background that really contrasts with the white bandages and the white body bag, and even more heightened by that strong lighting, kind of spotlighting the figure here, all increasing the emotion and drama of this image. And formally, this is, I mean, it's an appealing image aesthetically, but the content or the message behind it sort of contradicts it, that aesthetic pleasure with a very shocking image of reality. It's kind of a excuse me, kind of a visceral quality that challenges the viewer. Um, but even though the image may not be pleasant to look at for us or pleasant to contemplate, we can sort of receive its powerful message and really gain a deeper understanding about the artist's intentions and sort of the subject being depicted. And while the finality of death is often the subject or the theme of visual art, so is life after death. Really, death and the afterlife are pretty inseparable in most cultures. So here we're looking at a sarcophagus lid from the tomb of Lord Pacal. He was the 7th century ruler of the Mayan city-state Palenque. So he's illustrated here on the sarcophagus in low relief, and he's shown at the center of the cosmos, or the world tree. So here we have an illustration that might help you see the imagery a bit easier here. So Lord Pacal rests on a sort of slab here that marks the intersection of the earthly realm and the underworld. The Mayan underworld is called Xibalba. And so these jaws sort of rise up on either side of that platform, potentially representing the underworld, kind of reaching up to take this Mayan ruler. We also have above him a tree of life, a sort of cosmogram that represents the understanding of the universe. But it's also interesting in that it's sort of a cross-like shape. Above that, we have a celestial bird, and then around the remainder of the image, we have various ancestors of Pacal going back about 6 generations. So Pacal is sort of positioned in this fetal position, which is interesting if we think about the fetal position as, you know, having to do with birth or the early stages of life, and then coming back around at the end of that cycle with death. But again, framed by the jaws of the underworld. And his position really conforms with Mayan depictions of birth. And so he's likely, well, there are 2 ways to read this here. We could potentially see this as Lord Pacal being kind of descending into the underworld, or we could look at it the other way, in which he is ascending, kind of floating upwards out of the underworld along that tree of life. So this sort of becomes a powerful statement about, again, death and rebirth, or destruction and creation, kind of this idea of vitality and new life after death. Most belief systems involve a final act of judgment before the deceased is allowed to pass into the afterlife. Typically, how we live our lives, the choices we make during our lifetime, these determine the impact that we have on the world, but also how we are perceived during our lives, but after our lives as well. And so this judgment based on our lives is often the theme of visual art of various cultures. Many times judgment scenes feature symbols of justice in which life is sort of held in the balance. And we can see that here with the scales. So scales are objects that are used to weigh or to measure other objects, right? And in the case of judgment scenes and the theme of sort of afterlife or life after death, these symbols weigh the soul as a form of judgment before it can pass on. So this is an excerpt from an ancient Egyptian Book of the Dead. These books would be, sorry, excuse me, these books would be placed in tombs alongside the dead. They were essentially scrolls that contained hieroglyphs and illustrations and served as sort of a manual to help the deceased successfully navigate their journey from death through the underworld to the afterlife. In the New Kingdom period of ancient Egypt, they believed that the soul would receive final judgment from the gods before entering the afterlife, which is the scene being portrayed here. This particular scene, or excuse me, page, comes from a Book of the Dead for an individual named Hunifer, who was a royal scribe. He died about 1275, 1285 BCE. And so this illustration shows Hunifer entering into the 3 stages of the afterlife. First, that he must undergo tests from the god Osiris, the god of the underworld, and from Anubis, the god of death and burial. So here in this scene on the left, it sort of reads left to right here. On the left, we have Anubis leading Hunifer forward by the hand towards the first test, towards those scales, right? And so Anubis weighs Hunifer's heart, the seat of the soul, on the scale against the weight of a feather to judge whether or not he has lived an ethical life. The feather is thought to be taken from the goddess Mot, the goddess of truth, who was a sort of winged bird human hybrid creature. And so we also have the god Thoth, the bird-headed individual right here, recording the results of our weighing of Hunifer's heart, right? Now, if the heart is too heavy, if it weighs more than this feather of truth, then it is given to this creature, this sort of crocodile, hippo, lion hybrid creature named Amit, the eater of the dead. However, Hunifer's heart was not too heavy, and so he passes the first test, and the god Horus leads him through to Osiris, the ruler of the afterlife, who sits enthroned here with his sister Isis and Nephthys behind him. There's an open lotus in front of him, and on the lotus we have 4 small figures. These are the 4 sons of Osiris, each protecting one of Hunifer's vital organs. And then along the top register, we have these sort of kneeling or crouching figures. This scene shows Hunifer being accepted into the afterlife and kneeling before the 14 gods of the underworld. Final judgment scenes are prominent in Christian art as well. This one in particular is by the artist Giotto. It was done between about 1305 and 06, and it is in the Scrivini Chapel in Padua, Italy. This is actually on the entrance wall of the church, so during the sermon, the congregation would be facing sort of away from this, but then when they turn to exit the church, they look at it, so it's the last imagery that they see. So we have Christ surrounded by the apostles and the hosts of heaven. Angels above them are sort of rolling back the curtains of the sky. And below Christ, we have the archangels Michael and Raphael holding a cross sort of in the middle as Jesus casts his last judgment. On the lower left, we have the blessed being escorted into heaven by angels. They're sort of levitating slightly. Most of them are sort of praying with their hands together, or perhaps looking up at Christ. You might notice just below them we have individuals sort of clawing out of their graves. So these are the deceased who are being raised from the graves to be judged and taken to heaven. And then next to them, we have a kneeling figure who offers a model of a church to three women. This is Enrico Scrivini. He was the patron for this work, so the owner of the Scrivini Chapel and the commissioner of the frescoes. His family were bankers, essentially, and so they were worried about their own commitment of the sin of usury, which is essentially the charging of interest for any kind of money that had been loaned. And so in order to sort of get right with Christ before the final judgment, the Scrivinis commissioned this chapel and these frescoes to be built. So this kind of small scene within the larger judgment scene shows Scrivini kneeling and offering this particular chapel to the three virgins here. Now, on the opposite side, on the lower right, we have a scene of the damned entering hell. So we have this large blue demon, kind of Satan figure here, very kind of dramatic with his horns. He's actually eating a person that has recently been cast into hell. And we have kind of these layers of individuals. This is sort of representative of the circles of hell. And towards the bottom, in this area, you might be able to pick him out. There's a hanging man. This is meant to be Judas, and to show us that this is sort of the deepest or lowest level of hell for those who have committed the most atrocious of sins. So again, this image was on the entrance wall, or I guess you could think of it as the exit wall. It would have been the last image that churchgoers viewed as they exited the church, and so sort of a prominent message of kind of the idea that you should always remember your final judgment is coming, and that you should be living your life accordingly, because you don't want to be taken by surprise and end up being cast into hell, right? Similarly, we have Michelangelo's Last Judgment scene at the Sistine Chapel. So this is on the altar wall, so it's actually behind where the Pope would have been leading Mass, so it would have been looked upon by the congregation during the sermon. This image features 300, at least 300 figures in a sort of infinite variety of poses. And it depicts the same event that Giotto depicted, the Last Judgment, in which Christ has returned, sort of in the center here, very muscular and powerful, to give his final judgment. Just below him to the left, we have Mary and other saints and biblical figures, as well as the elite of heaven. And again, we have the separation of the blessed and the damned. The blessed were sort of being pulled upwards towards Christ and towards heaven. One of the angels is sort of using rosaries to help pull the blessed upwards. And then even lower, they're sort of floating downwards to wake the dead from their graves. On the opposite side, we have the fires of hell and Charon the oarsman, who transports souls across the river Styx to hell. And various demons are here kind of harvesting souls with pitchforks. Sort of in the middle of the composition, we have an interesting feature. So we have Saint Bartholomew, who was a Christian martyr who was killed by being flayed, so his skin was removed from his body. And so we have his heavenly body here, but he's holding his flayed skin, which is a little creepy. However, the flayed skin is said to be a self-portrait of Michelangelo. And if you notice kind of the position of that figure, somewhere between Christ and between the damned, but not really grouped with the damned, almost as if Michelangelo is commenting on his own sort of worries about his personal fate, as if he's questioning whether his own soul will be accepted into heaven or damned to hell. And so we can sort of think about this as a less optimistic version of this final judgment, maybe meant to inspire fear amongst churchgoers and kind of scare them into the appropriate actions, things like that. It's also sort of interesting to look at Giotto's version and Michelangelo's version of the Last Judgment scene together. Giotto's is much more organized into sort of sections of figures. They are kind of in these nice, neat rows. Still lots of action, and, you know, we have this kind of scary scene of hell here, but it's much less dramatic and less chaotic than Michelangelo's version.